Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today. We still have several people rolling on the attendee list, and so we're going to give it about 90 seconds, and then we'll get rolling with today's webinar. I'll be back with you in just a moment. Hello again, everyone. This is Susan Olson from Genscape. I'm the VP of Biofuels here and want to welcome you to Emerging Trends in Ethanol Transportation and Storage. This is a webinar that Genscape is hosting, and really appreciate you attending today. My colleagues and I are excited about what we have to show you today. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get into the material. We really appreciate your questions. So I think they enhance the webinar and can present some other topics that people are interested in learning about. So please submit your questions anytime during the presentation in the box at the bottom of your screen. And there's a Q&A button and a questions box will pop up. We'll treat all questions anonymously. We'll answer them at the end of the presentation. If we don't get to your question during the webinar, for time's sake, then we will work with you directly to get your question answered, or may even produce a Q&A document depending on how many questions that we get during the webinar. So, and just a brief few points about our business as a background to what brings Genscape to present this webinar today. We have two segments to our biofuels business. The first part of our business has to do with environmental credit verification, specifically RFS2 RIN QAP, the Quality Assurance Program that was established by the EPA, and Low Carbon Fuel Standard Credit Integrity Program, which is a commercial program right now that's not a part of the mandated regulation. So we've created a monitoring option with both of these to streamline credit assurance and to build confidence that the industry didn't have before by bringing real-time monitoring to credit assurance. We do this across all fuel types. That's all RFSD codes across 4 continents. We've been in the business since the QAP program's inception and actually helped shape its development. We have a lot of depth on our team in regulations, especially some of the more complex ones that you see with things like the new biogas regulations and some of the new cellulosic regulations. And we also know a lot about renewable fuels technology. But why we're here today is more about the second part of our business, which is bringing transparency to ethanol trading and procurement. So one of the parts of that business is actually bringing services that show ethanol storage, which will be a lot of our topic today. You can see at the picture on the right how we actually go about doing that at Genscape. We use aerial flyovers, usually helicopters or fixed-wing aircrafts manned with infrared cameras, and actually take images of tanks and storage fields. And you can see there in the image, the lighter colored part of the image will tell us how much volume is actually in that tank through the thermal imaging. So we produce reports on New York Harbor, Gulf Coast, and brand new, our Chicago inventory report will start on Tuesday, September 8th to be part of our commercial package. We also have an ethanol production monitor that brings information about 80 or more individual ethanol plants, I believe we're up to now, that shows ramp-ups, ramp downs, and also just generally information about the level of production that's going on via natural gas nominations. And then wanted to mention that coming soon in 2016, we'll be populating our global ethanol monitor service and also Glen Yard rail service. So you'll hear a little bit more about that, but that's focusing on transportation, both imports and exports of ethanol, focusing on the United States right now, and then also what's going on domestically with rail congestion, starting with the Glen Yard rail around Chicago. And I wanted to, I won't be doing this alone today, so very glad to have my colleagues with me, Dylan Mertz, an analyst as part of our biofuels group. He's been with Genscape for a while doing analytics, not just for biofuels, but also for crude. So welcome, Dylan. How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing excellent.
Great. And my other colleague, Jim Venhoff, is here with us today. He's a manager in our biofuels group. He does a lot of work with the QAP, and also he's been doing research and development in our rail products. So welcome, Jim. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks.
Great. So I'll get us started today with our agenda and go through some topics, and then Dylan's going to talk about transportation in terms of our vessel transport, and then Jim will take us home today with a conversation about rail congestion monitoring and what's been going on there recently. So here's what we're going to cover today. First, we'll introduce the storage regions that Genscape monitors and show comparisons and contrast to the relevant PADDs. Then we'll be showing some recent findings about transport of ethanol actually within PADD 1 from one part of the PADD to the other that can have a build and draw impact on the PADD 1 EIA statistics. We're going to talk a little bit about the intelligence that Genscape is putting together about U.S. ethanol imports and exports, and also just a general picture of what's been going on year to date there. We're also keeping a watch on domestic transportation issues with rail congestion monitoring. And Jim will talk about that at the end of the presentation. So, and just to give you a picture of kind of what to expect, this presentation will be very data-driven, summarizing year-to-date activities and pointing out some notable happenings that have been going on along the way. So we'll start out today with our ethanol storage regions overview. New York Harbor is the first region that Genscape monitored for ethanol commercially. We currently monitor about 2.5 million barrels of capacity, ethanol storage capacity in New York Harbor. That's comprised of 13 terminals that are listed there in the bullet point. And for your reference, you'll get a copy of these slides if you haven't already as being part of the webinar. So that's there for reference. Those include 43 tanks. The total PADD 1 capacity is about 15 million barrels. The two capacities that are listed there, the bottom one is the actual shell tank storage capacity, not including pipelines and any plant storage that might be in that region. So all in all, Genscape monitors about 17% of the PADD 1 capacity, and that's by just monitoring New York Harbor. So this is what's been going on in New York Harbor over the last 12 months. You see the green part of the graph is showing the capacity, and the blue part of the graph is showing the capacity usage over the last 12 months. So ethanol stocks have been a little bit higher in 2015 on average than in 2014. So you see that there was a dip during the winter. It was a relatively harsh winter, and then things built back up in the late part of the winter. Wanted to mention that the dip in the green bar that you see at the top there is typically due to things like when we see maintenance of a tank or an occasional switch over from a tank from ethanol to some other product. So we monitor that on a weekly basis. We also continually monitor things like permits to give us more intelligence on that. But I will say that ethanol capacity has been relatively stable, and in our experience over the last 12 to 18 months, product switching has been very infrequent. So this is a comparison of New York Harbor and PADD 1. PADD 1's a pretty big PADD all the way from the tip of Maine down to the tip of Florida. But New York Harbor does a pretty good job of indicating what's going on in the total PADD. There are some times when things vary, and part of that can be explained by Intra-PADD transport, which we'll talk a little bit about later in the presentation. But overall, the correlation is pretty good for representing 17% of the PADD. So the second region that we monitor is the Houston area storage in the Gulf Coast. So again, we monitor somewhere around 2.8 million barrels of storage. This is among 9 terminals that comprise 54 tanks. I also wanted to point out that we also monitor some non-fuel ethanol storage. We monitor Intercontinental Deer Park, which is mainly industrial ethanol and ethanol used for chemical processes. So the total shell capacity for the tanks is about 6.9 million barrels. So we monitor about 40% of total tank capacity in the Houston area, or I'm sorry, in PADD 3 overall. with monitoring the Houston area. So here's what's been going on in the last 12 months in the Gulf Coast. Relatively stable storage levels is what you would expect in an operational area kind of like Houston. We did start monitoring some additional storage terminals in the early part of the year, and that's why you see the increase in the green line there. I will say that there has been some recent draw from the Gulf Coast, and we'll talk about that in a little bit of detail in the next slide with the comparison to the PADD. This data actually I wanted to mention too is through August 21st. There has been 1 week of additional storage that was available from the EIA and from Genscape after this slide presentation was prepared. So just wanted to mention that. From time to time, there are some differences in the other 60% of the Gulf Coast outside of Houston. There have been exports from the region outside of Houston that we'll discuss later in the presentation, and we'll just show brief examples of that in the next slide. Something else I wanted to mention is over the last 2 reporting weeks, there has been a pretty big draw from the Houston area, just shy of 350,000 barrels. Oil tanking Texas City, Kinder Morgan Galena Park, and Vopak Deer Park have accounted for the largest part of that activity. And like I was saying, there are shipments, exports out of the Gulf Coast that are not originating in the Houston area, that are originating more in the New Orleans area. And here's an example of 3 ethanol shipments that we've confirmed outside of Houston. And Dylan, I didn't know if you wanted to say a few words about these shipments and kind of what you found there.
Yes, as Susan said, this table shows the 3rd stage of our export tracking, where ideally we will confirm an export. Here we see vessels that were observed berthed at ethanol storage locations in New Orleans, and the confirmation is based partially on port traffic data from other countries and partially on educated assumptions. And this table is an example of both. For Jamaica, our port intelligence is currently very thin, but we were able to track the vessel to a chemical terminal that primarily deals with ethanol. And we'll discuss this a little bit more later. We'll come back to this table when we're going over the process that we use to evaluate these vessels. But you also see here in Brazil we have a number of data sources that we scrape regularly and collect into a database. Some of them provide traffic only, some will provide the product type, and some will additionally provide volumes, as you can see here, that we received for the port of Suape in Brazil. So, like I said, we'll return to this slide later in the presentation. If Susan would like to carry on to the next slide.
Thanks, Dylan. Yep, sure will. Thanks for the commentary. So we're very excited to launch the Chicago area storage next week. We monitor all of the major terminals there, Kinder Morgan Argo, Buckeye, and Kinder Morgan Stony Island. It amounts to about 928,000 barrels of storage. So this is the 3 terminals and about 25 tanks among the terminals there. There's a pretty big difference between the shell capacity and the tank storage capacity in PADD 2, and this is because of the large presence of ethanol plants in that PADD. So all in all, we monitor about 14% of the PADD 2 tank capacity in that region. So this is a first look of what's been going on in Chicago over the last 12 months. So you can see that there was a big dip during the winter, again, kind of a rough winter, and then a rebuild, and then after the quick rebuild, a fairly stable volumes over most of the spring and the early part of the summer. But just in the last 4 weeks, we've seen about 100,000 barrels being drawn from Chicago between the dates of July 31st and August 28th. And comparing to the PADD, again, this is about 14% of the PADD. This is showing the data through August 21st. There's a generally good correlation between Chicago and PADD 2, again, about 14% of the total PADD. Chicago is valuable not just because of the help it gives to seeing what's going on in the PADD, but because it is such a largely traded hub, and just having the transparency into what's going on to Chicago itself is valuable. And so, yeah, Dylan, I was going to turn it over to you again here. Something interesting about capacity in Chicago. We've seen some new tank construction going on.
Yes, as a part of our regular infrared flyovers, we also collect visual images for the purpose of monitoring maintenance operations and product changes. And here we show kind of a time series, both for Kinder Morgan Argo and Stony Island, where we can see the construction of single tanks adjacent to other ethanol tanks. And in this next pair of images, we can see the most recent pictures that we've gotten from last Thursday, and where the tanks are almost complete. We cannot say for certain that either of these are going to be put into ethanol service, but due to their proximity to other ethanol storage, we will be monitoring them. And once they get put into operation, we'll have the opportunity to identify them.
So Dylan, one thing I was going to, oh yeah, sure. One thing I was going to point out is it looks like in the background there at Kinder Morgan Argo and in the front of the picture at Stony Island, there is that classic kind of black marking that happens on ethanol tanks. Is that typically an indicator of ethanol, or is that do you see that in other fields as well?
Yes, tanks that have been in ethanol service for several months, unless they're cleaned regularly or painted regularly, will tend to get a very signature coloration. It's caused by a type of fungus that actually grows off of the ethanol vapors. And as you can see, as you mentioned, the foreground at Stony Island, it's very clear there on that tank. All of the tanks around this new tank are ethanol tanks, and that's one reason why we're very optimistic that this new tank will be also in ethanol service. But you can see it's even darker at Kinder Morgan Argo in the tank in the background.
Sure, sure. And the other thing I was wondering is that, during these aerial flyovers, what kind of indicators do you get if there's going to be like tank switching, and is that something that we regularly watch for?
That is the primary intent for us to continue visual imagery after we've done our primary research on a field. And what we look for are open manholes or any type of, as you can see in the construction on this on the Argo image, there's actually a hole cut into the side of the tank, and this is where they would be able to, on an existing tank, they would have to cut a hole like that to go in and refinish the inside, to recoat the surfaces. We would see something like that when they are either doing maintenance, if there's been a problem, if there's been a leak in the bottom of the tank, or they would have to open up manholes on the side and vent out the tank, sometimes even attaching fans, allowing any excess product to be vented out before they can, and then cleaned before they can change the product. So these
wow, that's fascinating.
These activities are very signature to changing products.
Great. Thanks a lot. Well, I'll take the rest of this section from here. So basically we wanted to wrap up this section by talking about what do ethanol stocks look like going into September. So based on this data is actually based on the week ending August 28th that just came out this Wednesday from the EIA, and currently for the entire United States we're at about 19 million barrels in storage overall. So that's well below the record that they've of their recorded history of about 22.7 million barrels. But if you look at what we looked at was for the week ending, the last week of August, U.S. stocks for this year, and then what's happened the 5 years prior to that. What you see is that we're actually at a record for this time of year, so even exceeding what happened into 2012. So storage fullness is pretty high for going into September compared to history. And then finally, I just wanted to show a comparison of the Genscape measured storage regions and PADDs 1, 2, and 3 compared. So there is just to show how those compare together, when you add them together, we've got about 20% of the storage in PADDs 1, 2, and 3 combined, plus the non-fuel ethanol terminal Intercontinental, which is not included in this particular comparison. This is just the fuel ethanol comparison with the EIA. So that wraps up our section on the ethanol storage regions and kind of the picture of storage fullness going into September here. And so next we're going to switch to talking about some intelligence that we've been gathering on ethanol movements within PADD 1. We've been researching shipments between New York Harbor and Port Everglades. PADD 1 is a pretty broad PADD. The EIA delivers ethanol stocks information for the entire PADD. They don't break it out by the PADD 1A, 1B, or 1C like they do for some other products like crude, I believe. So what can happen is if a shipment leaves PADD 1 and returns to PADD 1 across a survey week, then you can see a you can see a draw and then a subsequent build because of the transit. So we actually, we're going to show an example. You see a divergence here between New York Harbor ethanol and the PADD 1, and we're going to show an example of this happening during that particular time period. So this table shows the change in stocks. The left-hand column shows the change in PADD 1, and the right-hand column shows the change in the New York Harbor inventory. And these are week endings, just like the EIA does in their stock survey. So basically, you see that there's an agreement in the directional change in the PADD 1 in New York Harbor. And in this particular week, there was a ship that left New York Harbor. This was actually a chemical transport vessel, not a barge. It was a bulk chemical vessel. And the New York Harbor and PADD 1 both indicated draws. And then you have a ship arriving the next week in PADD 1, and that was reflecting a build during that particular time, but not so much the impact on New York Harbor. The intra-PADD movements, we think, are contributing to the differences between the total PADD and the New York Harbor inventory changes. It doesn't necessarily explain all the difference between New York Harbor and PADD 1, but it does explain some of those differences, and in particular may explain directional differences from time to time. So that's what we're discussing here today. Again, the PADD is obviously a big PADD, so there are other activities going on in places other than New York Harbor, and that certainly explains why those two things may be different. So before I get into actually talking about ship tracking, I should introduce part of our product line, which is the Genscape Vessel Tracker. So Genscape bought a company called Vessel Tracker about 3 years ago, and Vessel Tracker had a really great network of AIS antennas to track ship signals. So we now have the largest private network of AIS antennas, and we also supplement that with satellite activity. So we can pretty much instantaneously track any ship using AIS signaling on a fairly instantaneous basis all across the world. So we get location and destination information on demand from this part of our monitoring technologies, and we also get reported draft and vessel speed as part of it. In addition, like the picture shows there on the left, we get images of ships so you can see what it looks like and some metadata, and then also we get the ability to trace the ships from different origins and destinations over time. So using that, basically, we've located a chemical transport vessel. During that period of time we discussed, it was actually in Motiva Seawarren outside of it was at a berth there on May 22nd, and so you can see the Motiva Seawarren change in the plot there. And Dylan, I was going to flip this over to you, being our vessel expert, and let you kind of take it from here.
Okay. Yeah, as Susan said, in this table you can see the EIA reported change compared to the New York Harbor, what we observed. And you can also see that Motiva Seawarren made up a majority of that change that we observed. And in that period of time, we also observed this vessel Chemical Pioneer at port near Motiva Seawarren at their northern berth. and being there in the week of change, we decided to investigate a little bit closer to see if this vessel could be transporting ethanol. So we were able to track this vessel from New York down to Port Everglades. It also visited a berth in Philadelphia. And looking a little bit closer, we found some information from Port Everglades port activity. We can see it berths right here, and we can see that the port records indicate that it was carrying ethanol. And then we looked a little bit closer, and we discovered that in this track from January to September, we can see that Chemical Pioneer has made the same cycle of visits, mostly to the same locations, repeatedly. So we can see that Chemical Pioneer has visited New York, Philadelphia, you can see Jacksonville, Port Everglades, several locations in Houston. It looks like once it went to a location in New Orleans, and you can't see it very clearly, but it also stopped in Port Canaveral a couple times. Interesting thing about this is that Chemical Pioneer visited Port Everglades 6 times this year, and each time immediately preceding it had visited Motiva Sawarin, and the collected port records indicate that the ethanol was the product in delivery to Port Everglades. So even though it's not within the scope of this presentation, we can also expect that on the return trip from Houston, the vessel was probably carrying petroleum products or some other product from the Houston area up to the Northeast in New York and Philadelphia. Does that sound like it covers everything, Susan?
Yeah, I think so, Dylan. I was just going to say, we've been talking a lot about also trying to determine things like, basically with our tank level data in the New York area, we've been doing some more looking at this to try to figure out if we can tell how much is on the ship and how much that's actually contributing to a potential change in PADD. And that would be something that we actually consider including in the global ethanol monitor. Even though it's part of the U.S. shipment, I think it would be beneficial to have that part of the picture for PADD 1. So thanks a lot, Dylan, and I'll continue on here and just talk about the global ethanol landscape. So we'll start today with a discussion of exports and then end up talking about imports. So just to get us started, I thought we would show what's going on with annual U.S. ethanol exports year-to-date this year compared to the previous 5 years. This is from the EIA data on exports, and the light blue bar you see there on the right is what's happened year-to-date in June, and then you see the prior years in the darker blue bars. So there's been about 10 million barrels exported year-to-date. So we're almost identical, not quite identical, but very close to what we did last year. We're on pace to be a little bit higher than last year, but very, very similar to the type of export volumes we saw in 2014. And as another comparison, what this graph compares is year-to-date activity through June for consecutive years using the EIA's export data. So on the left-hand side, you see the total U.S. exports, and then the two groupings on the right-hand side are to the top 2 destinations, Brazil and Canada. So with a continued progression of where we've been year-to-date, the U.S. will be up slightly. Brazil will be up, and Canada will be down. Some of the Canadian exports are, we talked about earlier this year in a webinar, are due to economic benefits compared to the use of gasoline. So that may have something to do with the reduction in imports over and above their mandate there in Canada. And then this is a look at the breakout of U.S. ethanol exports by destination, comparing where we are in 2015 year-to-date mid-year to where we were last year in total. So far, the number of countries receiving U.S. exports is not as high. We've had 33 so far this year compared to 46 in 2014, and that's counting every shipment, even single barrels. But the EIA data reflects 6 months in the year still to go, so that may be having something to do with why we haven't seen as many countries receiving ethanol from the United States. That has not had a very big impact on the total that we're delivering out for certain. So the changes between the exports in proportion between Brazil and Canada are apparent. There's less proportion going to Brazil and Canada combined from 2015 looking back to 2014. So we are seeing more exports going to Korea, Netherlands, Tunisia, and India, and then less exports to the UAE, Spain, Finland, and Puerto Rico. And we have a little bit more information about this on this chart. So what this graph shows is if we were to linearly project where we'd be in 2015, what would the change be between 2015 and 2014? So this shows the top 10 export destinations with the total in the orange bar on the left, and each of those export destinations in the blue bars on the right-hand side of the graph there. So again, this has changed from 2015 to 2014. So overall, the exports, again, very close if trends continue. Canada down, Brazil up. And then exports to other destinations actually account for about a 1 million barrel increase over last year, so in total. And now we want to start getting into actually how Genscape is creating ethanol export intelligence. So we're working to provide the industry with more transparency into imports and exports. The biggest challenge is really isolating ethanol shipments on chemical tankers, which can hold many different products within the ship's compartment. So this is how we're trying to tackle that. We have an advantage in terms of having tank-level storage data. So for exports, we identify tanks that are typically used for export draws. We do also volatility and grouping analysis from time to time when that's helpful. Now, that's not the only places we develop this type of intelligence for exports. It's not just where we monitor storage. We also monitor other Gulf export locations for vessels moving out of there. And then for imports, in Florida, for instance, we don't have storage monitoring there, but certainly monitor imports coming into those destinations. So what we do is then we match those storage draws where we have actual storage data with periods where chemical tanker vessels are moored at the terminal. And where we don't have storage draws, we actually use just basically the signature, other parts of the signature development, which include, things like, has the ship been to this location before? What are the ship's patterns? Where did it come from? Where is it going? And then other types of intelligence that we can gather from ports and moorings and things like that. We then also use database resources to corroborate ethanol shipments to international destinations, and we'll show some examples of that here in the coming slides. So our reporting, which is still in development, is really data delivery in 3 sections. The first section is a rolling list of chemical tankers moored at relevant ports, just raw data. The second then shows the analysis and likelihood of the tankers carrying ethanol based on what we know about the signature and in some cases about the storage at that particular port. And as the vessel journey progresses, we continually provide information on ethanol shipments and confirm those as we realize that they are ethanol and they get closer to their international destination. So over time, our intelligence capabilities are strengthening. We're getting a better event database. Our vessel database is increasing, and we also are gathering more and more international port data. So in this data, there may be instances where not all the vessels are confirmed. We try to make volumes available when we know them. So in the next slides, we'll show a couple of pieces of intelligence that Genscape uses to derive its shipment information, and then we'll show some excerpts that show recent shipments from a sample report. So Dylan, I'll pass it over to you again to talk a little bit about some of these indicators and then to talk about the sample shipments. Dylan, I think you may be on mute.
Thank you.
No problem.
As we mentioned before, one of the primary places to start our investigation is with these tank level changes. So we see here an example out of Vopak Deer Park from February, split out to show the changes in individual tanks. This graph shows the change between February 13th and 20th in green and between the 20th and 27th in blue. And what we can get out of it is that it appears to be a build and storage in these two highlighted tanks in the first week, what we assume to be in anticipation of export. And then the large draw in the subsequent week seems to confirm this assumption and encourages us to look closer at the vessels visiting this terminal in that period. What we discovered was, among other vessels, this perfect example, the Slowman Heracles, that had visited Vopak in that period of time and then traveled directly to Brazil, which we were later able to confirm that the vessel was carrying ethanol as an import to Brazil. And we can move on to examples of the report, and as a previous slide described, this is kind of the rolling first step. Through Vessel Tracker and some additional tools that we have developed to use the Vessel Tracker data, we're able to collect a list of vessels visiting these berths of terminals of interest. And this particular example is from the New Orleans area and only includes vessels of a type that could be carrying ethanol. So we filter out crude vessels, crude tankers, cargo vessels, bulk carriers, and we get this much shorter list of oil and chemical tankers. And from that we record the times at berth, the ports visited before the berth of interest, and the stated next destination. And we also collect the draft information, which is sometimes indicative of the activity occurred at berth, but can sometimes be confounded by other factors, such as visiting other berths at the same port before leaving. Sometimes the drafts might not reflect any kind of activity, or you might have a load and a draw in the same port before they change the draft information. So sometimes it can show us something, and sometimes it really doesn't show us anything. This second example is the next step. It's a watch list. As it is the case for international destinations, the vessel may be traveling for weeks before arriving at its destination, or it may set its destination for an intermediate point before stating its actual destination. So we have to continue tracking vessels for a period of time, sometimes multiple weeks, before we see where it is actually going. We also collect, in this notes column, you can see we also collect information from other sources, other recent deliveries, and other activities that might give us an idea of what habits this vessel might have, what paths they might be going in the future, and if they've ever carried ethanol or have recently carried ethanol. All of those might be indicators to gauge our confidence that the vessel might be carrying ethanol, or it might not. And then hopefully at some point we'll get to this third stage where the vessel can actually be confirmed. As I was speaking about this before, we observe the vessels at the berth of origination and track them to a ethanol receiving berth, and that's an indicator that they might be carrying ethanol. In the case of Port Esquivel, Jamaica, we tracked the vessel directly to an ethanol terminal and observed a change in draft that indicates the unloading of a product, and that was seemed to be enough evidence that they were carrying ethanol. Whereas with our Brazilian ports, many of them have enough port information that we can determine that conclusively that there was ethanol, and in some cases, as the case with Swape, that we can actually see the actual volume delivered. So our goal is to confirm ethanol exports, which is not always as easy as it is to confirm imports, which will eventually show up in U.S. Customs. So, Susan?
Thanks, Dylan. I appreciate that commentary. It's very helpful. I'll give a brief note on imports, and then I'm going to flip it over to Jim Venhoff to take us home and talk about the transportation that we're watching for rail. So we didn't want to leave imports out since we talked about exports. What you're seeing in this graph is imports of fuel ethanol into the United States, the EIA and the census data based on the FAS consumption compared. And so you see that in the orange bars on a year-over-year basis. And you do see some difference between those two sets of government data. What we noted is mainly it seems to be from differences in particular countries like Brazil, although there are some differences overall, and sometimes occasionally one has a country that the other data set doesn't in particular. So, but those seem to have more minor effects. It really seem to be more volumetric differences by country. The green bars show the year-to-date for June for the latest month available from the census data when this presentation was prepared. So the point there really is that year-to-date through June, there's very little import activity has occurred so far this year. It's less than a third of what happened so far throughout the mid-year last year. So there seem to be lots of negative factors pushing against the ethanol industry right now in Brazil. So that may have quite a bit to do with it. And then what we also wanted to show as part of our global ethanol monitor that we're planning to launch in 2016, we're watching shipments that could potentially be carrying ethanol into the United States. And one of those is the chemical tanker Cardinal. And Dylan, do you want to talk a little bit about this one?
Yes. I mean, one of the benefits, as we've mentioned, is that we are monitoring the activities at international ports, and we're regularly adding new ports and resources. And one of the benefits of this is advanced intelligence for imports, potentially weeks in advance of U.S. Customs data. So we see here that we observed Cardinal at the Port of Santos in Brazil, which is one of the biggest export locations for Brazil, and we see that they're loading 24,000 metric tons of ethanol, álcool in Portuguese. And through Vessel Tracker, we're able to see that the stated destination was Tampa, and we observed it, visited another port in Brazil before heading straight towards Tampa. And with this advance notice, we were able to preclude the U.S. Customs data, but as I said, sometimes more than a week. So, Susan?
Thanks, Dylan. And I think that pretty much wraps up this section. And Jim, you've been doing a lot of work on looking at the congestion monitoring in Glenyard. Maybe you could talk to us. I think what you're planning to talk to us about today is a little bit about kind of how we're doing what we're doing, and then also just giving a snapshot of what the congestion is looking like there right now in Chicago.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Susan. So what I'll start with is I'll actually go ahead and start with a brief overview of Glenyard itself. So Glenyard is actually located just north of Kinder Morgan's Argo terminal in Chicago. And just for a point of reference, it's also just north of Midway Airport and also CSX's Bedford Yard, or Bedford Park as well. And what we've actually identified as it can be used as a staging area for ethanol unit trains. And then even though the yard has roughly 20 lines in it, it was also identified as a potential bottleneck for rail traffic through Chicago. So what I'll touch on now is kind of how we're doing what we're doing. So we're actually able to analyze images collected each week from flyovers of Glen Yard. So the types of information we're looking for from the flyovers include the counts of cars in the yard, which is then broken down into actually cars per line, as well as the car type in the yard. And then even further, we look at the car types and actually look at the some markings on the cars as well, which I'll get into here in the next slide or two. And one thing I wanted to point out on this slide too is on that pie chart towards the right, it actually kind of shows a typical representation of what we're seeing in the yard, which it's mostly tankers, with the next prevalent car being a hopper car, and then some random stragglers like box cars and gondolas and intermodal transportation, things like that. So the first thing I want to look at in the actual data piece is just kind of a week-to-week snapshot of what we're seeing at Glen Yard. So this is the first 11 weeks of data we've put together of just total car counts we're seeing. And what this does is it will kind of give a quick snapshot of what is currently in the yard, as well as if any trends are forming. And the overall car count usually trends with the hoppers and tankers, as you can kind of see here. So this would kind of indicate whether or not things are being built up, or if the car is or if the yard, is relatively empty. So just a quick snapshot of that. And then next, this is part of the congestion analysis that we've been putting together. So using that detailed data we collected from the images, we're actually able to review the current congestion. Using a number of measured parameters, things like the total car count, the cars per line, the car types, including their lengths, and a few other things, we can actually estimate the used capacity and determine how full the yard is. And this can be important to know if you're moving product in the Chicago area and you're planning on moving through Glen Yard. If you actually know that the yard is sitting at 90 or 95% capacity based on just cars sitting there, you might change your mind and decide to reroute to avoid costly delays, because if you have to delay a shipment by days or weeks, it can be very costly. So from the plot we're actually seeing here, this kind of gives a quick snapshot of the congestion per line. So lines 3, 5, and 9 are sitting pretty full, upwards of 70, 80, 90% is occupied by actual rail cars. There are still a few lines open, and 6, 7, and 8 are relatively free. So what we've done is we've taken a parameter like this, as well as a couple of other parameters I just mentioned, and kind of try to boil it down into a single quick snapshot. So based on, for instance, this subset of lines at Glen Yard, we actually boiled it down to these are 54% full. So kind of indicating that the yard isn't so full, at that current point in time. And so next, what we're working on in addition to even the congestion is we want to even go a step further and actually try to figure out the total ethanol sitting at Glen Yard when we're doing these flyovers. So using the images we're collecting, we're actually able to identify a couple parameters on the tanker cars that will actually point to it being loaded with ethanol. For instance, some of these things can be just the length of the car itself, reporting marks, logos, and actually the placards. And so through our research, we're also able to determine some beginning and end points of ethanol shipments actually traveling through the yard too, which is obviously an indicator of ethanol moving through the yard. Lastly, there is also, next steps would be actually taking the similar analysis and actually moving it to other yards in Chicago and potentially beyond. And so what I'll end with is actually, this is actually the link to our pretrial registration for the Glen Yard Ethanol Barrel Monitor. And what this will do is it'll actually give you, the subscribers of this will actually get periodic updates of what we've collected, what we're doing, and also give you the opportunity to reach out to us and ask questions. So, and with that, Susan, I'll hand it back off to you.
Thanks, Jim. I'll leave that link there for a moment, but I think everybody's going to get it in they'll get it in the slides that they receive, and should be able to just click on it from the PDF. So. And I think that really wraps up today all the material that we had prepared to present to you today. If you're interested in the newly available Chicago Ethanol Inventory Report, please feel free to visit that page and learn more and sign up for a free trial that will start next week. So we do, gentlemen, have a few, actually several questions that have come in over this period of time. So what I'm going to do is pick out a handful here that we have, 3 or 4 that we have time to answer during our remaining time today. And then we do commit to, if we didn't answer your question online today, that we will get back to you either individually or send a Q&A document after the webinar is over today. So Dylan, I'll throw this one over to you, but one of our questions is, how do you determine which tanks in a terminal are ethanol?
Well, it's a multi-stage investigation, so we will start with a facility that, for one reason or another, we suspect has ethanol, or we'll kind of go over a number of facilities and review each of them. We'll start with looking at publicly available permits, such as Tier 2 air emissions and other public data, mostly from government research. Then we'll look at right-to-know public data. A lot of dangerous chemicals have to be registered, or there's requests to be registered. We can file FOIA requests to get certain amount of information, but often this information might be a couple years old. It might be subject to change, without updating the document. So our next step, after we have kind of evaluated the paperwork, we will schedule a flyover and we will check the facility for labels on tanks, labels on pipes, any other indicator. As we mentioned before, ethanol has a signature discoloration that often occurs on the sides of the tanks, and through all of that we can put together a picture of which tanks are ethanol and which are not, and that's basically it.
That's great. That's a great description. So if there are any parts of that question that we didn't answer, please feel free to reach out to me at the contact information there online, and we'll get more information for you. But I think, Dylan, you did a pretty thorough job there. So another question that we get about some of the monitoring that we do. Jim, what are some of the indicators of an ethanol rail car? How do you determine which one of which cars are rail cars and which cars are other types of cars?
Sure. So it starts with the obvious of, is it a tanker or not? Obviously, hoppers aren't going to carry ethanol, but then going beyond that, it's looking at the lengths of the car, because certain lengths of cars may indicate different types of products in them, and then also there are sometimes logos can actually be a good indicator of what's in the tanker, as well as placards. Placards are also a great indicator, because with the Department of Transportation placards that have to be included on the tanker car, it'll actually give you a subset of quantities that can actually be associated to that placard. So with combining all those things together, we can make some reasonable assumptions that it's actually an ethanol tanker car.
Sure. And a follow-up on this, and this is something that I know I'll let you take a crack at it, and then I can help out there if needed. But I know that are we looking at just in terms of when we're tracking things coming out of the yard there? I know that's kind of a second step, but could you talk a little bit about, are we just looking at shipments going a certain direction like eastbound, or are we looking at things going out of the yard in all directions? Or maybe you could talk a little bit about when the cars are leaving the yard, like how we get a handle on that.
Yeah, sure. So we're not really focusing on one direction or the other. We're kind of just focusing on overall rail operation. So we do want to see, we are trying to see things coming in and out either direction to try to get a handle on what's occurring at the yard. So that's kind of the gist of it.
Great. And another thing about transportation from Argo, and Dylan, I can ask you this because I know that you've looked at this some, but have we had any experience tracking barges out of Argo, and kind of how have we tried to go about that, and kind of what have you observed in some of the research that you've done previously?
To be honest, we looked into it, and it's kind of been on hold for a long time. It's something that we do plan on looking into again. One of the obstacles is that the primary tracking that we use for shipping vessels is through the AIS tracking signal. And when you get to rivers, the AIS is only required for the tugs and is not required for the individual barges. So what we end up seeing is tugs going back and forth, and we can't really see what tugs that they might be moving, or which barges they might actually be moving around. There are some developments that we have been working on to mitigate that issue and to fill out the picture, but it's currently on hold. So it might be something that we can find a solution for in the future.
Yeah, that's great. That's very, very helpful. And I think that there's a difference between the tugs and the barges, and that does seem to be one of the tough things to be able to differentiate. But like you said, we're working on some ways to be able to have technology to do that. So one of the questions that we got, and I'll take a crack at this one, and Jim and Dylan, feel free to jump in. And I think this will be our last question because of time today. But the question is, how do we know if vessels and rail cars are empty or full? For instance, when ocean tankers are going back to Brazil, whether they're empty of ethanol or not. And similarly for rail tank cars after delivery is going back to the Midwest, whether or not they're empty. And I think that from our perspective, we use a lot of intelligence around the shipment itself, so we can look at things like the draft of the ship when it leaves a particular port. We can look at port data to tell us whether or not a particular shipment has arrived at a location to see how much volume has been offloaded or loaded onto a ship. And then and we've got an advantage in terms of having some of the tank level data in many of the ports, especially the ports in Houston for exports, to be able to see if there was a tank draw corresponding to a ship actually leaving the United States. So Dylan, anything to add there on the tanker being empty or not when it goes back to Brazil?
No, I think you covered it pretty well. There is a little bit of ambiguity there. I know when we started working on this, we assumed that just as a matter of efficiency, that everywhere a vessel goes, it's going to be carrying something. But as we've been watching this, as I've been investigating this, I do get the impression that some of these vessels might be transporting products in a singular direction and not carrying something back. As you mentioned, though, we do look. We try to get information from both sides of a voyage and put together the picture from both sides. So we can see some evidence on the U.S. side and some evidence on the Brazil side, and we kind of weigh the evidence to see what kind of story we think it's telling.
Right, right. And it is also possible, right, that there are some backhaul of things other than ethanol because of the different compartments on the ship. And I think maybe we have, I don't know that we've seen evidence of that before, but it certainly seems possible.
I would assume that's best practice, but I have seen some vessels that I don't think are doing that. So I think that most vessels do have some sort of backhaul. But I can't make an assumption that all of them do.
Got it. Thanks a lot. And similarly, with the rail cars, Jim, I mean, I think that we generally use intelligence, knowing, we have some proprietary methods of knowing where the tank cars are coming from, which tells us something about whether they're full or empty in all likelihood just from the origin. But are there other things and tools that you think we can use to tell whether a tank car is empty or not?
Yeah. So you hit the nail on the head with the first aspect of it. We have proprietary monitors that can actually, knowing the origin of the shipment actually gives you in the direction, obviously, with it. It gives you a lot of good intel right there of whether or not the tanker is full or the tanker car is full or empty. But then also some of the markings as well, like the placard, for instance, is another really, really good indicator as to whether there's actually products inside the tanker car or not. So, combining things like those two things together will actually give you some reasonable assumption that whether or not product is actually in the tanker car or not.
So, Jim, are you saying that they take the placards off when the tanks are empty?
Yeah, that's generally what we're seeing happen.
Got it.
Okay, that's good.
Well, gentlemen, I thank you very much for working together today on this webinar and all the information, and really appreciate everybody that came to the webinar today and that was a part of it. Thanks for all the questions. Like I said, if we didn't get to your question at the end of the webinar here, we'll definitely get back to you with the response in the next few business days. So everybody have a wonderful rest of the week, and thanks so much for your attendance, and that'll close out our webinar for today.